I often see and hear confusion around the definition of terms like remastering, reissue, and a repress. These terms get interchanged a lot, and there's a lot of confusion around the differences between them. I'd love to discuss those on this episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local but you are in the U.S., you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com, and would love it if you'd subscribe to our channel here on YouTube, follow us across social media on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at NTX Vinyl. Let's clear up some confusion around some commonly used words in the vinyl hobby. Remaster, reissue, repress. I would almost go on to say remix. There's a lot of re's in here, right? And I think that's a lot of the reason why some of these words get interchanged and used in incorrect ways and without context, right? So first of all, let's talk about remastering. I think this is a very important term to understand. Mastering and remastering. So as it pertains to vinyl, it's a critical step to make sure that the audio output that you're hearing coming out of your speakers from your turntable is pleasing to the ear, right? And everybody's ears are different, but there are mastering engineers, and it's their sole job to make sure that the audio that gets cut into the record is going to sound good coming out of a $100 turntable or a $10,000 turntable, right? And that's a hard balance to strike, but that's the goal of the audio engineer. So the artist goes into the studio, they record their music. That music is then mixed or remixed in some cases, if it's something that was previously already recorded in the past and now they're doing a remix. So that is essentially establishing the right volume and the placements for all the instruments and the vocals, right? That's what a mix is. It's mixing them all together and making one composition, if you will. At that stage is when mastering comes in. Once a recording is completely mixed or remixed, then mastering happens, or again, remastering, if you will. And that is essentially the engineer going, okay, what format is this going to be heard on? Is it going to be heard on radio? Is it going to be heard just, coming through, earbuds digitally? Is it going to be heard on vinyl? And there's a different approach to each of those. So there are specific mastering engineers who do things different when the recording is going to be output for vinyl. And that's very important because the frequencies, the lows, the highs, the mids, all those things are treated differently. It's a subtle difference, but it is treated differently as it pertains to vinyl versus, again, a digital output. So when you see remastered on a sticker or you're reading about it on an album, that simply means that they took the original recordings. Again, it doesn't matter if this is a new recording or if this is something that's 50 years old. If it's remastered, that means they went back to the original source tapes or the original source files. It doesn't matter if it's analog or digital. You can remaster any type of file. They went back to the original source of the audio, and the mastering engineer, with a fresh set of ears, went through and has done his work again, specific to the output of vinyl. Now, this is a critical step, like I mentioned, because if the mastering is botched, if it's mastered too hot, if it's mastered too low, that means your volume is going to have to be adjusted. It can also really have an effect on the clarity of the music, on the depth of the music, and in general, just making sure that it sounds good coming out of your speakers. That's the mastering process. Completely different from mixing. This isn't, this guitar is going to be louder or not, or these vocals are going, are going to be heard more clearly. Not necessarily. Like, it's more about separation, and it's more about the dynamics of the music and making sure that it sounds great. So one of the misconceptions is that all reissues, which I'll get into next, are remastered. And that's not necessarily the case. Just because it's an old album and it's coming out again, it doesn't mean it was remastered. In a lot of cases, it is, and that's for one reason. That's because technology has come a long way. So something that was mastered in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s most likely deserves and needs and warrants a remaster in 2023, right? Because technology, in a good way, has come a long way and can really help that original source file. Again, we're not remixing. We're not changing the essence of the music in regards to where the vocals are placed or how the drums sound, or how loud an instrument is. It's not about that. It's not about changing the essence of the recording. It's about getting it to a point where it will sound its best on a specific format and making sure that the levels are all proper. So again, when you hear it coming out of your speakers, it's the way it was supposed to, intended to be heard by the musicians who recorded it, right? So again, not everything is remastered, but I would say most of the time, if it's an older recording, it does get remastered prior to getting reissued or repressed. And that is because, again, technology's come a long way, and that's a great thing that these remasters, that the engineers, the producers, and the artists, they want to go back and remaster this stuff, because in most cases, they wish they had the technology that we have today back, 10, 20, 50 years ago. They would have done it this way originally, but the technology wasn't there yet. And so remastering is a very important step, and it's probably the most confusing word out there in regards to vinyl production, and especially as it pertains to older recordings that are now getting re-released. A lot of people see remaster. I've seen people see remaster and go, "Oh, I don't want remasters. I want it to sound just like it did back in the day. I don't want them to mess with how the music sounds." It's like, you're not going to hear a difference in regards to the mix. This is not a remix. A remaster is a different thing. So it's a very important thing to clarify. I'm not a mastering engineer. I've been in plenty of recording studios in my days, and so I'm doing my best to explain it in layman's terms as I understand it, right? You could go to experts in the audiophile world and go listen to mastering engineers talking about the specifics, and they'll get into the detail of it, but that's kind of the way I think of it as it pertains to vinyl. So, all right, so that's what a remaster is, and that's what remastering means. Reissue, a reissue versus a repress. These are two very specific things. So, a reissue is essentially a new version or a new issue of an album. So when an album originally comes out, you've got the original pressing, let's call it, whether it's a first or second or third. Get into the presses in a minute. But you've got the original press of an album. So pretty much anything after that, if there's going to be a new version or a new issue, it's going to be a reissue, right? There is a stigma around reissues of, oh, reissues never sound as good. Well, you got to keep in mind, let's pretend an album came out in 1980. There could be a reissue later in 1980, or 1981, still an early pressing and still sourced from the original masters, but it's just not the first one because they sold so many, they had to reissue it pretty quickly, right? And so an issue is essentially another version. Like, I'm kind of using those interchangeably because I think people understand the word version a little more. Now, the version could be identical. Maybe they didn't want to change anything about it. The packaging, the sound, the disc labels, the look, the feel, the sound, everything's the same. But because it's a new version, because they've already sold through that first pressing, this one is called a reissue. So it's simply a new version of it. Now, in today's terms, you hear reissue a lot, especially as the vinyl boom has kind of taken hold, and there's been a lot more people buying records, and it's kind of why I'm filming this, because there's a lot of people who are new to this over the last couple of years. A reissue of an older album is very common. And does it mean it's automatically going to be lesser quality? No, it does not. Does it mean that it's going to sound better or worse? No, it's not. All of those things have to do with the particular album, with the particular remastering and then the manufacturing, whether or not it's a reissue or not. There are original presses, there are first presses of albums that came out long ago and that are being pressed right now that are inferior to reissues, simply because it comes down to quality, attention to detail, and again, the specifics of the mastering and the manufacturing process. So I get frustrated when I talk to people and they say, oh, I don't buy reissues at all, I only buy originals. And I also hear the opposite. People go, oh, I don't buy original stuff, I only buy the reissues or the remasters, right? And that's where these terms get interchanged a lot and create a lot of confusion. And in a lot of ways, I don't think the industry helps itself because they don't provide a lot of clarity around this stuff. They expect that the normal record buyer who just started collecting a year ago or 5 years ago understands all of this. And that's a little bit short-sighted, I think, on the industry's, from the industry standpoint. And you know, certainly could be fixed with some clarity on these terms. If they over-indexed on education in regards to terms like these, as opposed to you know, words like limited edition and numbered copies and all those types of things, which are more marketing generated terms, I think that would help everybody. But you know, we're not there. So that's a reissue. Again, is essentially a new or a different or a second or third or fifth version of an album, right? So then what's a repress? Okay, so a repress is essentially another pressing within one of those reissues. So again, you may have an album that came out in 1980. It sold really well. All of that original pressing, let's say it was a couple thousand copies, are gone. So the label says, hey, well, let's go ahead and create more of these. Well, if they have the stampers that made those albums available and they're still in good condition, they're just going to run more of that album. And that's not a reissue. That's just a repress. They're just pressing more from the original stampers. They're not changing the artwork, the packaging, the look, the feel, or the sound of the record. They're just pressing more. So that's a repress of the exact same issue or version, right? That creates a lot of confusion because immediately people think, oh, well, it's not the first pressing then. Well, no, but it came from the same stampers. And there is definitely a line of thought that says the earlier pressed copies of any album are of higher quality. That's why a lot of audiophile people like to get test pressings. They like to get promotional pressings because typically those are the first ones that are manufactured and then are distributed to record stores, radio stations, at least back in the day they were. And so the health or the quality of that stamper that's actually making the record is you know, has not deteriorated at all in those early stages. Now, after that stamper is used for thousands and thousands of records, eventually it needs to be retired, and it cannot be used anymore because it's a physical thing and it wears down after time, after being in the factory, in the pressing plant, being used so much, right? So that's when a reissue is needed because then they need to go make completely new stampers. And when you go make completely new stampers, a lot of times things can change because this is a physical process. Now they do their very best to make it identical. They want to, but that is when it's then a reissue because now this is a new version sourced from new plates or new stampers, right? I'm probably getting some of this wrong, but this is kind of how I think about it. So roll with me. So, you know, again, a repress versus a reissue. This comes up a lot these days because an album will become available. Let's say it's a more modern album. And people will ask me, well, what year is it from? And I'll say, well, this is a repress of the 2017 reissue. And that's typically when I can just see the people on the other side of the email or the message exchange just going, huh? Like a repress of a reissue? Like, what are you talking about? It's 2023. This just came out. So why is it, if it's 2017, well, isn't this a new version? It depends on the label. It depends on how they position it in some ways and how they treat it. But again, it happens pretty frequently that if you look on the outside of the jacket or you look on the disc label, it'll still say 2017, even though this just got pressed a month ago in 2023. That's because it's a repress of the same stampers that they're still using because they haven't replaced them yet because they're still in good enough quality to produce a good sounding album, right? So remaster, reissue, repress, you can see why there's a lot of confusion and a lot of cross-pollination of these terms and why they get misused a lot. It's confusing even for people in the industry. I end up, slipping of the tongue sometimes, be like, oh, it's a reissue, when in reality, it's not a new reissue. It's just a repress of a reissue, like I was kind of explaining. And so it's hard to keep all this straight, especially as it pertains to new vinyl production that's happening today, because there are a lot of albums that are now getting remastered, and then they're getting reissued, and then a year after that, the reissue is getting a repress. And so you've got the remaster, reissue, repress, all trifecta, and so again, you can see how this gets confusing, but those are some of the terms that I see the most confusion around. I've got another video I did a while back, which was, I think, breaking down A to Z, all the different terminology. I know those were in there, but these are the ones that create the most confusion. So I wanted to key in on those specifically. Hopefully this was educational. If I got any of this wrong, I know you'll correct me by all means. But again, this is just kind of how I think about it, and I think how a normal collector can probably think about it to at least differentiate between those terms when they're going to buy something or they're making a decision based on a certain pressing, so they can hopefully understand what it is they're buying, because that's the whole goal here, is to help people understand what they're doing within this hobby and what they're spending their money on. So there you go. That's a little crash course on remaster, reissue, and repress. I hope that was helpful. My name is G.I. Sanders. We will see you again soon on another episode of Talking About Records.